Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back, guys, in our course Sentence Structures, and today's topic is active and passive voice. What would you say when you ran to catch a school bus but you didn't make it? The bus had just left when you arrived at the bus stop, and someone asked what had happened. In Indonesian, you will say, "Saya ketinggalan bis." However, in English, you should say, "I missed the bus," right? You can see the difference. Saya ketinggalan bis. So in English, it's not "I was missed by the bus," but rather "I missed the bus." In another scenario, as you were chopping onions in the kitchen, a cat jumped onto you that you accidentally cut your finger. Someone asked what had happened. You said, "Tangan saya teriris," for example, right? But in English, you can say, "My fingers were sliced," for example. But rather, "I cut my fingers." So there is this huge difference between how you say something in Indonesian and how you say that same thing in English. And the difference is between active versus passive voice. I'd like you to identify active and passive voices from this short excerpt. Okay. So mood changes are said to have a psychological basis in the brain. As a result, scientists are studying these changes. Because people believe that mood changes are affected by the level of serotonin in the brain, researchers have conducted a study to determine what factors affect the level of serotonin. The blood of a large number of volunteers was taken throughout the year. Researchers then analyzed the blood to see when the amount of serotonin was highest and lowest. Researchers found that sunlight affected the level of serotonin, but it was not affected by temperature, air pressure, and amount of rain. So there is this mix of active and passive voices, right? Now if you see this, red bolded ones are passive voice, and the yellow bolded ones are active voice. So mood changes are said passive, sentences are studying active, belief active, or affective passive. Right? So pretty much passive and active voice are used quite massively in a piece of text in general. So what is voice? Voice is the form of a verb to indicate whether the subjects of the verb performs or receives the actions. Okay? So there are two types of voice, active voice and passive voice, as you have been familiar with. Let's start with active voice. Active voice indicates the subject of the verb is active. The subject of the verb is performing. Why? Because the subject does or acts upon the verb in such sentences. And so that's why the sentences are said to be active voice. For example, the tiger jumped onto me. As the subject, the tiger is doing the jumping, right? So the tiger does something active here, jumping. Jokowi will give a book to all children in the country. As the subject of a sentence, Jokowi is the one giving a book. It's the one that is acting upon. Okay, the printer ate my paper. So here the printer is the subject, is also doing the eating. Okay, so in all these examples, the subject does something to the verb. Okay. Passive voice, on the other hand, the subject and the object flip-flop. The subject becomes the passive recipient of the action. So in this construction, the subject is being acted upon, or the subject is being passive. the subject receives the action rather than initiating the action. Okay, that's why it's called passive voice. For example, I was jumped on by the tiger. So I, the subject, but I was the one being jumped on. A book will be given by Jokowi. A book is a subject, and it is a book that will be given. So in this case, the subject receives the action. My paper was eaten by the printer. So paper as the subject receives the action of being eaten by the printer. Okay. Task 1, I'd like you to change the form of the verb in this exercise into active or passive voice. So you have to really look at the context and understand it and see what it requires. When it requires an active voice, then make sure you change the verb in bracket into active forms. But when you think that you need a passive voice, then you need to change the verb bracket into passive voice. Okay. Here is another exercise. I'd like you to change the following sentences into active form of passive, if possible. Okay. So, for example, number 1 is an active voice. I will replace. So then the question is whether it is possible to change this sentence into passive. If you think it's possible, then create a passive counterpart. For example, in this case, number 1, in 2019, Jokowi will be replaced by. Okay. All right. And here there are some reasons why people use active voice, especially in the English culture. So most English writers or authors prefer to use active voice because it's more direct. So it's more cultural. Instead of saying the tray of food was dropped by the waiter, English speakers prefer to say the waiter dropped the tray of food. It's more direct. Who did what to whom, for example, is more obvious. And the active voice is also less awkward and clearly states the relationship between subject and action. So your request for funding has been denied by the review committee versus the review committee denied your request for funding. So in this case, the active structure expresses something more direct, something clearer. The review committee, the subject, that's the doer, right? Denied as the action done by the subject, in this case the review committee, and your request is the object. Okay. Alright, when to use passive voice? So there are cases where we need to use passive voice instead of active voice. Even though passive voice is less direct, less forceful, and less concise. So for example, we can use passive voice when you do not know or do not want to reveal the actor or the performer of an action. Okay, and then second, you can use passive voice when you want to emphasize the receiver of an action instead of the actor of an action. For example, my bicycle was repainted by John, so it's a bit awkward, right? If you say my bicycle was repainted, this is a deliberate example of passive voice, and here the speaker perhaps wanted to emphasize on the receiver, on the bike rather than the painter. And so it's an okay structure, and one of the possible motivations behind the use of this construction is the speaker wanted to somehow hide the painter or wanted to emphasize on the bike. My bike was repainted. Doesn't really matter who did that. Or something like Starbucks coffee is grown in Aceh. It doesn't really matter who grow coffee seeds. What matters is the place, and the emphasis is on Starbucks coffee. Or when Harry was reborn, Superman was already dead, so it doesn't really matter who gave birth to Harry, but what is important here is Harry. Okay. And when to use passive voice? Most commonly in scientific writing. So, for example, the experiment was conducted to probe the hypothesis. Instead of saying the researcher conducted the experiment to probe the hypothesis, it is quite less common to emphasize on the performer of an action in scientific writing, because what's important is what was done rather than who did that. Okay. Or when an agent and the agent is a thing, for example, the clock is set by a machine. It's a bit awkward to say the machine set the clock. Okay. In terms of forms, I believe you guys are already familiar with this. So in passive voice, we need a double verb, because it is always the case that a passive construction has to be in its appropriate form depending on the tense. In the present tense, we have am is are, in the past tense was were. Okay, and then plus the past participle form, usually affixed by and orta. Okay, for example, John baked the bread. The passive counterpart is the bread was baked by John. So we see this presence of to be verb and past participle verb. Okay. All right. So this is another example: is cake had been cake, was cake, is going to be cake. So the combination of to be plus past participle verbs. Okay. Another example. Okay. Alright, so another practice, I'd like you to change sentences below to the active voice. So, for example, the statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists every year. Possible answer is hundreds of tourists visit the statue every year. Right? Pretty straightforward. Another piece of practice, I'd like you to change the sentences below to passive voice. For example, children cannot open these bottles easily. We can say in passive counterpart, these bottles cannot be opened by the children easily. Okay, straightforward. All right, and this is the souvenir. I'd like you to imagine you are an inanimate object, and you write about what is done to you and with you in the course of the day. Do not tell your readers what object you are. Let them guess. For example, I'm made of china. I'm kept on the shelf in the kitchen. I'm used every day. Leaves and hot water are put inside me. Then I'm left on the table for a while. Afterwards, I'm picked up and hot water is poured out of me. Wait, here we go again. I'm being picked up and leaves and hot waters are being put into me. In the moment, my contents are going to be poured out and drunk. What am I? Okay, so that's an example. Alright, that's the end of the topic. Thank you so much for your attention. See you later. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.